right, we'll get started. Thanks so much for coming.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for braving the weather. My name is Kenta Murakami, and I'm a senior art history major at the University of Richmond and the 2014-2015 curatorial assistant at the University Museums. I'm joined this evening by Elizabeth Schlatter, Deputy Director and Curator of Exhibitions at the University Museums. Together we worked with the artists Erling Sjovold and Líndal to organize the exhibition that opens tonight, The Life in the Land, which is on view both in the International Gallery at the top of the hill and here in the Laura Robbins Gallery of Design from Nature through April 26th. In addition to participating in the exhibition, Anna is a visiting artist at U of R through the end of the month. After tonight's event, she will be engaging with the Parking Lot Project, which is a university-wide collaborative interdisciplinary site-specific art project led by Erling and executed by UR faculty, staff, and students, myself included, that mediates on environmental sustainability and land use. The Parking Lot Project is located in C Lot, which is in between Gottwald and the IM fields. So you're invited to come over any time next week to take a look at what is happening over there. The Life in the Land and its related programs are made possible in part with the support of the University Cultural Affairs Committee and the Office of International Education. So we'd like to extend a very special thanks to funding provided by the, and in addition, we'd like to extend thanks to funding provided by the Weinstein Summer Grants Program, which is also administrated by the International Education. Thanks to these grants, Erling, Elizabeth, and myself were all able to travel to Iceland and witness the country's landscape and engage with Reykjavik's unique arts. While he was there, Erling was able to participate in a month-long artist residence at the Hafnaborg Art Center in a town just outside of Reykjavik, and his work on view was directly influenced by his time there. Elizabeth and I went to Iceland last summer and met with several artists, gallery dealers, and curators. We also conducted some studio visits, met Anna, and thanks to the generosity of international education, were able to invite her to the University of Richmond to participate in this show. As the curatorial assistant and as a student, I really feel as if I've stumbled across this exhibition and all that has kind of come with it, kind of by a stroke of good luck and by kind of the really incredible generosity of the museums and their eagerness to work with students. So I'd like to kind of extend infinite thanks to Elizabeth and to the museums in general for really providing this for me. Yeah, and without it, we wouldn't have been locked on a 12-hour bus trip through the southern coast, subsisting purely on chocolate-covered licorice. So definitely an important experience. Yeah, so thank you.
All right, so before we get started, I'm just going to offer up a quick bio for each of our artists, and then we'll start asking some questions. Anna Líndal studied at the Icelandic College of Art and Crafts and completed her postgraduate studies at the Slade School of Fine Art in London in 1990. In 2012, she finished her master's degree in artistic research from St. Luca's University College of Art and Design, which is in Antwerp, Belgium. Since 1990, she's been active in numerous solo and group exhibitions in Iceland and abroad. She took part in the Istanbul Biennial in 1997, the Gwangju Biennial in South Korea in 2000, and she recently had some solo exhibitions at the ASI Art Museum and at Harbinger Project Space, and both of those are in Reykjavik in Iceland. And now she can add Richmond, Virginia to her roster of international exhibitions on her CV. Anna has also published several artist books, and she has taught fine art at the Iceland Academy of the Arts. And many of you know Erling Sjovold, professor of art here at U of R. He received his BA from art from the University of California, Berkeley, and his MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He's had also numerous solo exhibitions, including locally at Page Bond Gallery, at the University of Richmond, at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, and also at galleries in Santa Barbara and Chicago. He's been awarded several artist residencies, including one from the Marie Walks Sharp Art Foundation Space Program Studios in New York, and another one from National Park Service and the Center for Land Use Interpretation. So please join me in welcoming our speakers.
To get things started, we wanted to start with kind of the most obvious connection between both of your work, which is the Icelandic landscape. Could you both, from your different perspectives, begin kind of briefly by describing your art, since probably a lot of people here haven't actually seen the exhibition yet, and then maybe talk about how it relates to the particularities of the Icelandic landscape?
No, please. Okay. Do you want me to start?
Sure.
Hello. First of all, I would like to use this opportunity to say thank you to Elizabeth for inviting me and for all these great people who are working here. It is the technicians have been doing wonderful job, but there's a lot of people working with paper. It's a lot of paperwork to be able to come here. So thank you all for that, and Kenta and Erling. And I'm looking forward to meet your students and the parking lot. So if I start somehow landscape is just so natural for me that I don't have anything in that sense. It's just part of my life. So and I think probably everyone is attached to the nature and the weather. We have been having really bad weather here, and somehow especially in Iceland, it controls a lot of our lives. And I'm not only talking about nature or landscape, I'm very much talking about the person in it, and how and this relationship between nature and human. So that is what I'm working on, and maybe we come later to that.
So I'd never been to Iceland until I went on this trip, but I had been to Norway a number of times. That's my sort of heritage. My mother was born and raised in Oslo. I have relatives there. My father's family all immigrated from Norway, different parts. So I visited Norway many times, and Iceland, of course, and Norway, Denmark, Sweden all share sort of a similar root language. But curiously, even given this sort of short proximity with the languages, are quite distinct, and actually the cultures are different. So even though I was going to Iceland with feeling some kind of sense of whatever it means to be Scandinavian, it's really quite different. Even in the landscape, it's a very different one than Norway, and I have a lot of affinities for the Norwegian landscape. I've seen a lot of images about Iceland and read a lot about the landscape, but it wasn't until I rented a little sedan and drove around, started driving around the ring road. And the ring road is a highway, a national highway that goes around the perimeter of the island, and realized that I really should have had a four-wheel drive truck, because as soon as you get off of this, it's a two-lane highway. This is the national highway, and it's no more wide, with almost no shoulder, than most of the service roads that we just have, run around town. And you can drive maybe a couple hundred yards, maybe a mile at most, before that pavement, the asphalt, runs out and you hit dirt. And once you hit dirt, you start climbing up, especially in the southeastern shore where I was. And then it just opens up into a landscape that is so incredibly raw and beautiful. And there's just the references just shift immediately, sort of away from that built environment. Not that you don't see structures and roads and all of that. You're keenly aware that this has been traveled upon. But how it opens up so quickly from this idea of civilization is just, I can't get enough of it. It's a very powerful memory. And trying to get at that sense of just sort of disappearing into that kind of open space is really, really profound. And I don't know that the work gets at it, because I was really looking at a very local part of it in this glacial lagoon at Jökulsárlón. And that was enough. That alone was a kind of a world to take in. But just in general, the way, how you cannot have that kind of sense of landscape, I think, in you. And even as just a visitor, is really interesting and ultimately very provocative, I think.
Can you, just for people who aren't necessarily familiar with Iceland, can you talk just for a minute, like what are some of the natural features that Iceland's famous for, or what's going on in Iceland now?
I'm sure Erling could talk more emotional about it. But of course, Iceland has this extreme. Iceland is extreme. It's relatively big with very few people. It's only 350,000 people living there, and as I say, it's relatively big country. It's It's yeah. So there is a lot of volcanoes, and the volcanoes are always more and more active. And actually, what happens is when there is a volcano, it's rather than somehow losing it out, it adds up more pressure. So it's more likely that it will be more and more eruptions coming in the coming years. And it was a long gap till 1996 when we had this huge eruption, and that somehow changed a lot towards the idea of how to control the eruptions and so. And if I talk a bit towards my work, I'm part of the Glaciological Society in Iceland, so I have been having the privilege to visit Vatnajökull, this big glacier, and it's the biggest glacier in Europe, and stay there for a week every year, and where all the research are done, and it's a quite unique place to be in. And everyone thinks that a glacier is just a white, like a white ball, but it's full of life, and we also have hot springs there, mud springs inside of the glacier, and in some areas there are some plants, and it's quite amazing. So probably it tells a bit about the contrast between the ice and all this hot water and this geothermal heat in the land all over.
In terms of the geothermal, if some of you have been to Yellowstone, it has aspects of that where you have to colorate all the mineral deposits and the coloration in the water and all the steam vents and the mud pots, and the only difference is it's just like all over the place in Iceland, and you'll be driving along and all of a sudden there's a little sign, and it's like, okay, and you pull over and there's a whole bunch, and some are more sort of more tourist sites than others, but they're frequent, so there's just those kinds of surprises. There's there's not so many trees in Iceland. There's a lot of lava or pumice, basalt, some very unique sort of hexagonal columnar forms of basalt that you can find on cliffs, and which are extraordinary. It's a motif that Olafur Eliasson used for the opera house, or the opera house or the symphony there. As a design, really beautiful. So that's sort of an identity, marker of identity, I think, from the landscape that's adopted for, I think, a lot of sort of Icelandic architectural vocabulary in churches and whatnot. So there's this basalt and this black sand, of course, is gonna, from that dark gray basalt is sort of ground up, it becomes the sand of the beaches, it's picked up by glaciers. The glaciers aren't this kind of white, mass. It's something I was sort of writing about in the anticipation. I've been on glaciers before, but it's profound to go up and expect them to be kind of slick and clear and everything, only to find out they're incredibly coarse, they're full of volcanic ash, they're very, very dark, and they're hard, and they've got sand on them, and you have to get a pickaxe to do anything with them. So they know there's nothing, it defies those kinds of expectations. And so in my case, it led less to thinking about them as just visual forms and more to these like kind of tactile forms and the processes that they go through, carving mountains essentially in valleys and so on and so forth. So it just kind of, when I got there, so I think about it in a very different way than I would have anticipated. So despite researching it.
So I guess we'll ask another question. So Anna, in one of the photographs at the Lower Robbins Gallery, you appear, and you're swimming in an icy, water-filled crater. And Erling, your presence is implied by the expressive connection you have to your materials in the paintings of the glaciers. Glaciers are typically something discussed in a more scientific or empirical context. So we're wondering, when both of you are making your art, how important is the presence of the physical body, either within the work or within the landscape?
Yes. Both in this photo that you are talking about, and in one of the videos in the video sculpture I'm exhibiting, I use my own body as this measuring tool, and I think that is somehow in a contrast with all these instruments that you use, and somehow I think it's by using my own body, it's another way to have a relationship or to get to know the nature and the surroundings. So in that sense, I think it's important for me and how I deal with my work.
Yeah, so for me, I thought a lot about the idea of the gesture and the hand for this project, and it came out of, I think, wanting to get I didn't go there really to do, like, I typically paint a lot in oil paints, and they're these kind of dense masses, and I really wanted to be sort of free of that, and I wanted something kind of gestural, and when I went to the glacial lagoon, and I spent an entire day there, probably like 9 to 9, something like that. Of course, these are very long days, and just to watch the activity of these glaciers as they melt and bump into each other, and they'll start to, they're calving from the glacier itself, and these icebergs start to, as the day warms, they'll split, and they'll suddenly be very, very still, all of a huge splash. So the dynamism of that, and their contours are changing, because I go and, like early in the morning, I would see one, and I'd disappear, and I'd come back, and it's like it had been turned, and it had melted some, or part had fallen off, and so the dynamism of that contour, I just kind of wanted, I guess, to sort of think about a way to get at that in some essential way, and it was about line. But the other thing about the idea of the body, I think, is interesting, and the evidence of the hand is the, I mean, I'm thinking a lot about climate change. I've thought, even before going there, but I thought a lot about, the idea that with climate change, we make the weather now. And so it makes me think of abstract expressionism because in some ways it's about how we make it. In making the climate, there's this kind of sense that it's an expressive subject. Even though we may kind of look at it conceptually, but we're really dealing with a very profound physical presence. And I guess I think of the gesture in that way as this way of suddenly all of us and myself becoming authors of these kinds of natural forms and activities. So
maybe I can add a little to this. But what is interesting is somehow to open up to the surroundings, and it's possible if you just allow yourself to open up and to stay somewhere and to really take the time for things to happen. And then I can tell you about one experience on the glacier in the wintertime. For some reason you can see the stars all over. You don't have to look up. You can just look straight and see the stars. And this is something that I had never experienced before. And this is a really strong experience. So and I was the only one who took on many clothes and was sitting outside just to watch this. So it's a bit about giving it the time it needs to realize how it is. So that is the combination as well.
And just real briefly, that was my experience by just spending, I went with very few expectations to the glacial lagoon just to stay there. Mm-hmm. But the changes in the weather and like putting on clothes, taking off clothes, that kind of thing, taking on and off layers like that, just because it was really foggy and cold in the beginning, and then the sun came out and it suddenly warmed up, and then it got cool and windy, and so that was one thing. So I'm sensing the place through touch, but also the quality of the ice, this idea of texture and how coarse it was and how surprising, and then listening to these glaciers, like it's so quiet and still, and all of a sudden splash. And so all these different senses make you keenly aware that all of your body is really taking this in, not just your eyes. And so it does become a kind of a full experience that way. And I think part of what I wanted to do there is to kind of get at that in some senses.
Just to comment on that from our end, I know when we were doing a lot of studio visits, there was a really interesting kind of conflation that I think we experienced between landscape and the weather, or landscape and light, which I think I felt was really unique to Icelandic art. In particular, it's like, I think typically in maybe American context or whatever, there's much more of a kind of, I don't know, emphasis on the optical, and I think there it becomes much more about this kind of experiential thing, which I thought was really interesting.
Maybe because the weather changes so quickly.
Yeah.
There.
Possibly.
And there's
Yeah.
no trees.
Yeah, and no trees where you see it all.
Well, and you have to pay attention. I mean, you get out there, I mean, there's so many times when you're just, you know, you're alone. I mean, it's like wide open, and you're just like, wow, and you know, have that experience of feeling, you know, quite small and in this vast mountain ranges and, you know, fields of moss that just go for like infinity, it seems, and the weather's always changing. But I think you have to kind of tune into that. I was there in July, and it was one of the, in 2013, and it was one of the wettest and coldest Julys they'd had in a long time. And so yeah, there were days I was out there and it's like I'm thinking summer, but I mean I'm bundled up and shivering because I'm trying to paint or do whatever. And so you just have to kind of tune into it. So it's some of it's a choice, I think, just to meditate on those things, and others I think it's just not a choice. You'd be kind of a fool not to be paying attention to all the changes going on around you.
I think, wasn't that the name of Ronnie Horn's book, I Am the Weather?
Can you
that she
speak
did?
up, Elizabeth?
I'm sorry?
We can hardly.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think that was, thank you. I think that was the name of Ronnie Horn's book, I Am the Weather, where she interviewed a lot of people throughout Iceland about events in their life, and they were tied to weather-specific events. But they were very personal recollections based on what the weather was like when they had their, they don't have a christening or a baptism, it's a confirmation, when they have a confirmation in the church, and everything was about linked, their memories were tied completely with the weather, with those stories. So, and I'm sure students experiencing that in the parking lot project also will have a very close relationship to the weather at this time of year. Thank you for saying something. If we do start to get too quiet, please let us know. I appreciate it. I wonder if you two could talk about the idea of landscape as text, landscape as something that's readable, not necessarily by experts, just readable by people looking at the landscape, and then, you know, you're a little more explicit about it, Erling, I think, if you want to talk about the work at the International Center. But also in your work, there's so much about sort of measuring and experiencing and the gathering of data.
Well, at the International Gallery in particular, I have a series of photographs, and it is called Glyphs and Glaciers. And part of it was just sort of a coincidence between some experiences I had. And one was it was, of course, looking at these icebergs floating in the glacial lagoon and watching, you know, from one point at the Jökulsárlón, you can stand and you can see the glacier from which all these icebergs derive, and then you can just look down there and you'll see the little channel that goes out to the Atlantic Ocean, and once in a while an iceberg will just drift and just goes out sort of into oblivion, and it's pretty spellbinding. But you're also, you know, again, you're going there sort of thinking about, you know, these issues about climate and, you know, sea level rise, et cetera. It's kind of unavoidable. So they do become kind of coded in that way. So at the International Center, this experience from the glacial lagoon coincided with also going to the Met in New York. I flew out of New York to go to Iceland, and I've always loved the Egyptian collection, and in particular the hieroglyphic fragments. And I love how they're arranged and how they're partial, and they're incredibly poetic to me. Just their spacing and there's a lot of references to legs or hands and various things. So I started to think about both as kinds of text, icebergs and these hieroglyphics. And glyph comes from it has a couple of derivations, including the Greek, which is to carve, which glaciers, of course, do as well. But I saw both of these as kind of archival projects, I think. And glaciers are read anyway through ice core samples. You drill way down, and you go thousands and thousands of years, and they're just layers of atmosphere. But within them, and for those of you who went to Elizabeth Colbert's talk, she talked about that. The little bubbles inside are, have the history of basically our atmosphere, thousands and thousands of years prior. So they become text, and I kind of think of these strata with trapped air samples from many years ago, a little bit like the Rosetta Stone, I think, in sort of trying to put these fragments together, in the case of these Egyptian hieroglyphics, into a kind of story of civilization. But I think we're using glaciers in very much the same way. But you're also watching these texts, these fragments, drift out to sea and melt. So there's this kind of funny urgency in those, as far as archival projects go, the Met trying to recover these things and secure them, and at the other end, watching these other valuable kinds of texts just sort of drift off is fascinating to me. And so I've tried to get at that a little bit with the work of the International Gallery.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, the glacier, they somehow keep the whole story in them. So by drilling these samples, you can just see what happens thousands of years back. But it's true, there is a lot of measurements in my works, and I'm quite obsessed with measurement. And but it also comes straight to both culture and it's kind of power game between the humans and nature. And it's about the power of knowledge. It's a lot of power in knowledge. So it's gathering all this knowledge to be able to tell more about what happens, be prepared for the next volcano or avalanche or whatsoever. So I'm also very interested in mapping. I'm also measuring the scientists. So I'm mapping out their mappings, and that is makes also an issue. And what can I say more? It is yeah, I don't know, but it has a big role in my work, all this measurement and these various ways of measuring. And scientists also use their eyes and measure by seeing the same place again and again and again, and see how it changes. So and that is goes easily into language. Mm-hmm. It goes together. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Kind of like a recording. It's a recording.
It's a recording,
yeah.
Absolutely. And year after year after year, and it adds up this information. Mm-hmm. And and it is this power game. And I'm also, I've been also thinking about, because science has a very positive attitude, and they can do whatever. But at the same time, it's tons of oils that we carry out into the glacier every year, and we got this. In this eruption, there comes a new land. It's a land with no history. No one has seen it before. And immediately when human has the possibility, they are there. And immediately they can go to this new island. They are there. And this is, I think it's questionable. And but actually, we have this one island, Surtsey, that came alive in 1963, and no one is allowed to go there apart from scientists, and so there is a possibility to see a place, a newborn place, and how it develops on its own. So it has also to do with all these facts.
That's funny. Did Elizabeth Covert? I didn't get to get her to talk, but I know in the book she talked about how humans are the most invasive and destructive species, but that they always have been, right? That's not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's kind of maybe what you're hinting at with the possible destruction by these scientists.
Yes, they are. they come immediately.
Yeah.
There is something new to see.
Yeah.
And of course, it's amazing to see this new land. I think it's a very, 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 very big issue to have a new land without a history, especially because traditions and history are something that I'm working continuously with.
Could you both talk about the role of domesticity, or the idea of interior versus exterior spaces in the art that is on view? In particular, Anna, we're thinking of the elements in your work borders, and Erling, particularly about the trays that you've set below some of the paintings on display in the gallery. Oh, sorry.
Can you?
Yeah. Should I repeat the question?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so we're asking about the role of domesticity and the difference between interior and exterior spaces in the work on view. In particular with Anna, element from her video installation Borders, and for Erling about the trays that you'll see below his paintings.
Yes, this is another issue that is also very important. And of course, Borders has a very complicated cultural issue and political. And if I put it very simple, combining this domestic things and the videos with what we have been talking about is somehow that everything that happens outside, it reflects in your home, and everything that you do at home reflects outside. So it is both ways. And in this sculpture, I also have a video of a young girl reading out the Icelandic sagas, and this is exactly when she is about to be her confirmation, and this is in a way to talk about how culture and tradition are somehow moved between generations. And I chose Njála because the Icelandic sagas are really very important in the Icelandic culture. And then it doesn't matter if you have read it or not, because everyone knows the sagas, and you have to somehow respond to it in one or other way. And some of the photos that are you can see before entering the galleries, they are dealing with the same things. How you transfer the culture, and also for example, one of the images is about how to find what kind of ash has been coming from the volcano. And for example, to be a scientist, you also have to learn the culture around being a scientist. And the same if you're an artist, it's not enough, you have to learn how to behave as an artist. And so it is dealing with this kind of invisible things that are very strong in every society, and everyone knows it.
So with the pieces I have in there, I've got some trays, and there are two different trays that accompany some of the works. So in terms of interior and exterior kinds of experience, if that's sort of the question, several of the pieces in there are not archival intentionally, so they're sort of designed to be ephemeral, and largely through the amount of gum arabic I put in with the water-based materials, the watercolors will eventually start to flake off and come down, and little bits of sand will fall. And I have put in a lot of gum arabic to secure it to the paper, but there's so much it gets really brittle. So they're not archival, so there's this failure built into it. But the point of that is there's a couple of things. First of all, these are experiences that you, like to watch these glaciers, it's like giving yourself over to that experience and absorbing it and thinking about it, because they're going to be gone. And this relates a little bit to the role of photography, I think. Susan Sontag talks a little bit about that, in a very eloquent way, but about how we defer experience to this machine, essentially, to retrieve this experience for us, when in fact you always have an option to just not photograph, and then what are you left with? And it's memory. And so in some ways it is about memory, and these trays catch some of the sand that sort of falls, because I'm painting with watercolor, gum arabic, and sand. And so the sand falls and gets caught in these trays. So the trays, I always thought of as like this hand that collects them. And so I think of them a little bit about that idea of memory, and that is a way of interiorizing a sort of experience, and also, just being mindful to, if you're going to go to this place and give the expense and effort to go to some place, give yourself over to it. And I've gone on many backpack trips with cameras. I used to backpack a lot and take cameras and shoot everything. And then I've made some very conscious decisions to not take a camera at all, and it's really nervy because it's like, oh my gosh, will I remember this? And it's like, I don't know, was I here? So, then you just really focus, and your sense of scale is very different. And of course, drawing and painting becomes a memory aid that's probably the best of all, is that you just sit still. Even if you do I know I say this to students, but even if you do a really, really terrible painting or drawing, or just have a bad day of it, you will still remember everything about that place, the air temperature, all sorts of things, just the density of experience, people you might have met, conversations you have. It's really quite beautiful. So that's one thing about interior and exterior experience. I think, too, though, that there's this idea of a domesticated landscape that's going on with all of these. The aluminum is kind of referring in a very oblique way, without getting into it, but sort of to aluminum smelting that has been going on in Iceland, and this sort of the pursuit of cheap energy. So it's sort of a meditation on cheap energy, where on the one hand, the decline of these these ice sheets is in part due to this whole global kind of drive for cheap energy. Some of it carbon-based, and some of it can be clean energy, as it is with geothermal and whatnot, and hydro. But still, the quest for clean energy starts to become kind of an interesting meditation. And so I sort of get into sort of a rough equivalence with that. And then there's one with the glass shelves, and that's a little bit more of the kind of vanity, the bathroom vanity kind of thing, or the domestic kind of space. And those start to sort of just deal with these, well, they borrow from the sort of the Vanitas tradition, memento mori, this kind of idea of looking at the glaciers like sort of portraits, and their own kind of changing. So they become sort of reflections on ephemerality and mortality.
All right, one thing I wanted to ask Anna about your work in particular, we were wondering, when we met with you and talked with your work in Iceland, you talked about how a lot of the landscape is referred to in gendered terms, that there's a masculine, so you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, and how that's kind of tied into Iceland's own historical identity and the economy, and I wondered if you could maybe elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, well, I did a piece on how you name mountains, for example. And looking into that is that the masculine name are the name of some explorers, or the assistant of an explorer. So it is a name like Paulsfjall. And so it has a name from a specific person to remember this person and forever. But the female names, they are all related to the body. So we talk about shoulder and breast. And so that was the difference. That there are very few mountains named after a woman, and if it is, then it's just some Kristin or Tindar, and no one knows who this Kristin was. It's just Kristin. But everyone knows that Paul is assistant of this great explorer, and then of course it's very simple. It's a group of men walking around, and then they say, this mountain, this could be Magnus, this could be Sigurður, you know. So they give the names of each other. So it's very cute.
But does that also, I think you mentioned how that sort of tied into a gendered self-description of the country in a way, because like the history is tied so closely into the geography?
No, but what is really, really interesting is that when we were fighting for our independence, the weather has played a big role, and being if you are a real Icelander, you have to be able to fight the weather and be alone outside in the weather, and so that is so it has a very masculine identity to be a real Icelander. You have to be very strong and just always fight for everything. There's nothing soft there.
So if you go inside because it's cold, you're not a real Icelander? Is that which
I think well, the reality now, of course, is that you just jump into the car.
Right, you jump in the car, that's right.
And you don't feel so much cold because the habit is that most people have cars, and they just park in front of the doors, and they just take on a little jacket and jump into the car and drive. And actually, I was staying in Hawaii for half a year, and it's the same there because it's too hot, too warm, and everyone park in front of their houses and just squeeze into the car and drive. So you never feel it. So it's all about escaping the weather. So, but that is it was interesting to see this to do this research about the independence and what role the weather played.
How did they name that new island that just formed? What is that named after?
Surtsey. Surtur. That is actually Surtur is troll. I don't know what. We have troll in.
A troll, yeah.
Oh, a troll.
Like a troll, yeah.
Yeah.
Trolls are big in Norway, I know that.
Yeah, they're.
And Surtur is a very, very big and black troll.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's Surtsey.
Yeah, you don't mess with trolls.
Yeah.
Not the best.
No, wasn't there some survey where they were comparing, I don't want to offend anybody, but it was people who believe in trolls versus people who believe in God in Iceland, and they were both neck and neck.
That's only for tourists.
Okay.
Love these owl stories.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that is just made for tourists.
They did name the island.
Yeah.
Well, and in Norway, there's a very famous pass. It's very dangerous and narrow but beautiful too, and it's called Trollstigveien, I think is the name of it. So it's the troll way, essentially.
Yes.
So yeah.
So does anyone have any questions about elves or trolls or any other questions you'd like to ask our artists?
So I'm kind of familiar with Erling's work the most. I haven't been in the exhibition yet, but this question maybe you can apply to both. So I'm kind of interested in what it means to, or how you experience the work and how you kind of create a process for a landscape that you're going to be in temporarily versus a landscape that you visit over and over and over again. Like, how do you decide to treat it either before, how do you realize that you're experiencing it during the making of the work?
I think this is good for you.
Sure. So, when I love to travel, and but artistically speaking, I'm always overwhelmed, and I'm all the novelty of a place, and even if I've been there before, that tends to happen. And there's a part that shuts down. I'm always amazed at how all the urgency to try and make something from it and make it immediate is just so elusive, and so you have to digest it. And going to Iceland, it was no different. I went there, and sure enough, it was kind of overwhelming. And curiously, this whole project, I've decided while I was doing this, I think I'm probably doing the most trite kind of form you could for sort of contemporary landscape, and that is the idea of the glacier or the iceberg. But for some reason, I think spending a whole day there at the glacial lagoon and maybe coupling it a little bit with my experiences of Norwegian landscape, you know, a little bit, I said, just do it and find a way into it. And I think what really did it was just, some of this has to just do with thinking about it from ways that just aren't purely visual and dealing with these other sensory kinds of ways of apprehending it. And I said, let's just try it out and see. And so I felt like I was always a tourist doing these works. So the goal was to find a way to go deeper into it. And you know, maybe I did, maybe I didn't, I don't know, but I had to sort of play out my hand with it, and because it was meaningful to me, so I'd like to be able to possess it. But I went after probably the, you know, not a very unique subject for Iceland. They're kind of iconic, and while I was at the glacial lagoon, there's tons of tourists just coming in and out. The difference might be that I just sat there and, in a very nerdy way, just sat there, painted and photographed by myself, you know, for 12 hours, whereas opposed to coming in for 20 minutes and leaving with a bus. You know, but that's really, but you know, I know that's, you know, I can't even, you know, but I feel like I'm a tourist even when I go to Norway, even with all the relatives and family I have there too, and so I find it's always an interesting tension about just how, this gets into that question about, you know, interiorizing the experience, and at what point you just sort of legitimize it, I guess, to yourself, you know. And I'm probably just taking, obviously, I'm taking all this baggage into it, you know, so, yeah, that we don't have time for all of that, but I think everybody deals with it in different ways. And you know, you never step into the same river twice, right? So no matter, even if you're very familiar with it, you know, it's always going to be something different. Even if it's the James River that I visit all the time, it's always something very new. And the sense that you can actually sort of find a way into it that's meaningful for oneself can be really elusive. And other times it's like, wow, you're just very present, and it comes out in the work, I suppose, conceptually or through the material or the process.
If I have a short comment about my relationship to the landscape, I think probably I am more using the landscape to talk about the issues that are important to me, and a lot of them are these invisible things that are just like hyper objects rolling around, and goes with heritage and traditions. So I am more using the landscape to be like a voice in my work.
Yeah, I would echo that too. I mean, I think that at some point you get past, like, you know, all the stuff I was sort of talking about, but you get past it and you're just looking at natural processes that you associate with so many other processes you've observed, even in very different kinds of situations. But the transience of forms, they're changing matter, states of you know, entropy, or you know, weather moving, and so I might in some ways. In fact, what was really interesting when I got off the plane at Keflavik and we went, took the bus, and we're going through this kind of lunar landscape. It's the first time seeing of Iceland. I go, wow, this looks like Ridgecrest in the Upper Mojave Desert where I lived for 2 years, many, many years ago, because it just had, it was a lot of the same volcanic kinds of forms, you know, and kind of lunar, not a lot of trees, and you know, just some ground cover. And I'm like, and for a minute, it's just, it was so much like that kind of desert landscape. And from that very, you know, within 15 minutes of just leaving the airport, I'm like, wow. And I felt a very strong connection to that, and already there's a kind of overlay immediately. And so in some ways, even the Norway thing came later. It was mostly this weird thing of the Mojave Desert, Upper Mojave Desert. I'm like, wow, what's going on? So, I mean, I really wanted to process that, you know, this kind of lunar landscape. And sure enough, as I went through there, there was many more times when I would be kind of reminded of a lot that they shared with this, where, you know, geology is the place. And it's really about reading the land as just a geologic phenomenon. And it's full of metaphors and beautiful visual things and conceptual kinds of structures to work with. It's incredibly rich. So I think from that, just the sense of wanting to play with that is always enough.
Do you have any other questions? So do you feel like your artwork changed after your trip, Erling?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is all very new work for me. I mean, I think part of it I wanted to just get away from some oil painting for a while and thinking about tonal masses and these things and just think about line, and it was a perfect situation. And I have to say, I went out there, I was going to do a lot more like plein air studies, but the weather was so terrible and it forced me back into the studio, and I thought, it's like, because I went there, it's like, wow, this is beautiful environment. Why are there so, all these conceptual artists like holed up in Iceland, and they're just like thinking, and they're like chess masters and all this. It's incredibly interior, right? And I'm like, that's really interesting because it's just like so much about this physicality of their world. Well, I got out in there into that physicality, and it's like, it's cold, it's wet, it's really a problem to paint watercolors when it's raining, for example. So I started to think much more about just the ideas that were going on, and became that kind of it was more conceptually based, and it was really, really thrilling in a way to just have to abandon what I thought were going to be my plans for working outdoors exclusively to working in my head. And while I did a lot of studies there, the most important thing I had actually was just a little tiny notepad that I brought just from, I thought I was going to write directions like for bus lines to get here and there. But I ended up filling it with thoughts that I kept coming across as I thought for projects, and many of them I still would like to do, and it led to this. And they're just full of ideas, and that was the most precious thing that I've created, actually, the most valuable thing. It's just really super tiny, and it's still the most valuable thing I have. So it was just that was a very unique kind of process to go through, and really rewarding, and opened up a lot for me. So, I mean, I really want to go back, but it taught me a lot. Really great.
So then, just before we break up, Anna, could you tell everyone what you're going to be doing next after you leave Richmond?
Yeah. Well, I might add also there is two artist books in the exhibition, and they are all about how my daily life intertwine into the art I do. And it's diary based, so that gives lot of inside information about these places. Next stop will be Greenland, and I will be doing a research in Greenland from mid-May to mid-June. And there is a big conference taking place about climate change, and there will be NASA and I don't know how many big companies there. And I will be working with one more artist, and we are going to have an exhibition in the museum in Ilulissat. And afterwards, we'll have the possibility to go on a field trip to where PhD students are learning how to do measurement, and a week-long field trip on the glacier. And I think that will be a very interesting experiment. So that's next.
All right, thanks everyone for coming, and thanks for